The morning the Cimarron River decided to swallow the valley whole, Adelaide Hale was elbow-deep in bread dough and completely unaware that her entire life was about to change. She had been awake since before the sun crested the ridge, the way she always was, because a woman running a homestead alone in the Oklahoma Territory in the spring of 1882 could not afford the luxury of sleeping past dawn. There were 3 chickens that needed feeding, a milk cow named Bess that grew irritable if she was not attended to by 6 o'clock, a kitchen garden that was just beginning to show its first brave green shoots after the long winter, and enough chores stacked behind those to fill every waking hour until the stars came out again. Adelaide had learned in the 2 years since her husband Walter had died of a fever that swept through the territory like an unwelcome visitor that grief did not excuse a woman from labor. The land did not mourn alongside you. It simply demanded. So she worked. She always worked. The cabin she occupied sat roughly a quarter-mile from the eastern bank of the Cimarron, in a low, broad meadow that had seemed like paradise when she and Walter had first staked their claim in 1879. The river was beautiful. In summer it ran clear and cool, and the cottonwood trees that lined its banks turned to gold in autumn. In spring, however, the Cimarron had a temper, and this particular spring had been wet beyond any reasonable measure. Adelaide had noticed the river sitting higher than usual for the past week, had noticed the sky to the northwest carrying a bruised, greenish quality that she did not fully trust, but she was not a woman who worried without cause, and she did not want to be the kind of woman who ran from shadows. She had just turned the dough out onto the floured board when she heard hoofbeats. Not the lazy, unhurried sound of a neighbor passing on the road, but the urgent, ground-eating rhythm of a horse being pushed hard, the way a man rides when time is the one thing he does not have. Adelaide wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward the window without hurrying, because she had also learned, in these 2 years alone, that showing alarm too quickly cost a woman more than it bought her. She looked through the rippled glass and saw a rider coming across the meadow at a full run, a dark horse with its neck stretched long and low, and the man on its back leaning forward over the saddle horn like he was racing the wind itself. She did not recognize the horse. She stepped out onto the porch just as the rider pulled up short in a spray of wet grass and churned mud, and she got her first proper look at Graham Brenner. He was not what she expected from a stranger riding that hard. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pushed back beneath a weathered brown hat, and a jaw that carried 2 or 3 days of dark stubble. His eyes, even at this distance, even in the flat gray morning light, were an arresting shade of blue-gray, the color of the river when a storm was coming. He wore a canvas duster that was dark with rain along the shoulders, and his horse was breathing in hard, shuddering gusts. "Miss," he said, and his voice came out rough and urgent, not unkind but stripped of any social niceties because there was no time for them. "You need to get your things together right now. The Cimarron is going to flood. The north tributary above Haskell's Bend gave way sometime this morning. A rancher upstream sent word. The water is coming down fast and there is nothing gentle about it." Adelaide looked at him for one long moment. She was not a woman who took orders easily, and she did not know this man from Adam, and her first instinct, the one she had honed out of pure necessity, was skepticism. Strangers arrived with news of all sorts in the territory, and not all of it was trustworthy. "Who are you?" she said, and her voice was steady. Something shifted in the man's expression. He had clearly been riding hard, delivering this same warning to homesteaders along the river's path, and perhaps he had expected her to simply run. Instead, she was standing on her porch with flour on her hands asking for his credentials. "Graham Brenner," he said. "I have a cattle operation up near Caldwell. I was cutting through the valley when I came across Pete Ashford's boy riding hard with the news. I have been going from claim to claim for the past hour. Ma'am, I am not trying to alarm you without cause, but the banks at Haskell's Bend are already under water, and that is only 3 miles north of here. You have maybe an hour, perhaps less." Adelaide looked past him toward the river, and that was when she noticed it. She had not noticed it before because she had been inside, but now that she was paying attention she could hear it. A low, distant sound beneath the ordinary morning noise, a deep, rolling pressure in the air, the way a drum sounds not in your ears but in your chest. The river was talking, and it was not saying anything good. She looked back at Graham Brenner. "All right," she said. She turned and went inside, moving fast, and he swung down from his horse without being asked. Adelaide's mind was already sorting through the cabin's contents with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who had learned to assess what she could and could not afford to lose. Her money tin, which held the $83 she had saved over the past year from selling eggs and butter and the occasional piece of mending work, was the first thing she grabbed. Then Walter's shotgun, which hung above the fireplace and which she knew how to use. Then the box beneath the bed that held the things she could not replace no matter how much money she ever saved. The small daguerreotype of her mother and father taken before they had died of cholera when Adelaide was 12, her own marriage certificate, and the letters Walter had written to her during their courtship, which she still read sometimes on evenings when the loneliness pressed in too hard. She was wrapping these in an oilskin cloth when Graham Brenner appeared in the doorway. "What do you need carried?" he said. He was not hovering. He was not offering exactly. He was simply asking the question in a direct, practical way that she appreciated more than she could have explained in that moment. "The trunk by the north wall," she said. "It has my winter quilts and my good dishes. The dishes were my grandmother's." He crossed to the trunk without another word and tested its weight, then lifted it in a way that told her he was a man accustomed to hard physical work, the kind of effortless, rolling lift that came from years of it. He carried the trunk to the porch and came back. "What else?" "The small crate in the kitchen, preserves. They will keep us through next winter if we can save them." She paused. They will keep me through next winter." He glanced at her for just a fraction of a second, something careful and attentive moving across his face, and then he went to the kitchen. They worked for 20 minutes in a focused, almost wordless rhythm that felt strange given that they were strangers, but perhaps that was the gift of a genuine emergency. It burned away everything that was not essential. There was no time for awkwardness or social uncertainty. There was only this, the choosing and the carrying, the moving of a life from one place to another before the river decided it did not belong to her anymore. Graham made 3 trips to his horse and tied things on or stacked them on the porch railing with an arrangement that suggested he was thinking about the load, about balance and security, not just piling things haphazardly. Adelaide noticed this. She noticed everything because that was how she had survived. "The livestock," she said, coming out onto the porch with her apron still tied and her face intent. "I have to get Bess up to the ridge. And the chickens." "I will take the cow," he said. "You take the chickens. Is there a shelter up high?" "There is an old trapper's cabin on the east ridge, about a mile. The ground there is 20 feet above the meadow." "Then that is where we are going." She looked at him then, really looked at him, the way she had not quite allowed herself to do in the rush of the past 20 minutes. He was looking back at her with an expression that was calm and absolutely serious and completely without calculation. He was not trying to impress her. He was not angling for anything. He was simply here, in a crisis, doing what needed to be done, and something about that steadiness loosened a knot in her chest that she had been carrying for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it completely. Something changed in his expression then, very slightly, the way a candle flame changes when the draft from a door catches it and makes it burn a little taller and a little warmer. "You would have managed without me," he said, "but I am glad I was here." It was a strange thing to say to a near stranger, and yet it was exactly the right thing, and Adelaide tucked it away somewhere she could examine later when there was time. They moved fast. Graham handled Bess with the easy confidence of a man who had spent a great deal of his life around cattle, speaking to her in a low, quiet voice that settled the animal immediately. Adelaide moved the chickens in their wire crate, which was awkward and required both hands and caused the chickens to voice their indignation loudly and continuously, which was exhausting, but she managed. She always managed. The sound of the river was louder now, not a drum in the chest anymore, but something with teeth, a low, heavy roaring that was getting closer with a horrible, indifferent certainty. Adelaide did not look back until they were halfway up the ridge, and when she did, she wished she had not. The Cimarron had left its banks. It was not the dramatic, explosive flooding that she had imagined when she first heard the warning. It was something worse in its way, because it was so quiet and so complete. The river had simply expanded, spreading outward across the low meadow in a brown, silty sheet that was already lapping at the base of the cottonwood trees 50 yards from her cabin, and it was not stopping. As she watched, it crept another several feet, slow and inexorable, and absolutely indifferent to the fact that her bread dough was still sitting on the kitchen board, to the fact that she had planted her kitchen garden 2 weeks ago, and those little green shoots were already gone under the brown water. "Come on," Graham said from just ahead of her, and his voice was gentle rather than commanding. "Do not watch it, just keep moving." She turned and kept moving. The trapper's cabin on the east ridge was old but sound, its log walls still solid and its tin roof intact if somewhat rusty. Inside was a cold fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a rope cot with no mattress. Nothing else. But it was dry, and it was high, and it was enough. Graham tied Bess to a tree just outside and helped Adelaide get the chickens settled in a corner behind the table. Then he built a fire in the hearth, using wood from a small pile left under the cabin's eave, working with the efficiency of a man who had made campfires in worse conditions than this. Adelaide unpacked what she could from the bundles they had brought up, organizing things with the methodical focus she used whenever her emotions threatened to get ahead of her. When the fire was going and the immediate work was done, there was a sudden, unexpected quiet. They both stood in it for a moment, on opposite sides of the small room, and then Graham took his hat off and ran a hand through his dark hair, and Adelaide, for the first time all morning, laughed. It was not a particularly cheerful laugh. It was the laugh of a person who has just run very hard and is slightly astonished to find themselves still on their feet, but it was real, and it surprised her. Graham looked at her with those gray-blue eyes, and the corner of his mouth pulled up in something that was not quite a smile but was headed in that direction. "Are you all right?" he said. "I left my bread dough on the counter," she said. "You did," he agreed. "I worked that dough for 20 minutes. I know, I came in while you were working it." She looked at him for a moment. "I am all right," she said. "I have lost more than bread dough and I am still here. I will be all right." He nodded, and she had the sense that he understood exactly what she meant without her having to explain it. They stayed on the ridge for the better part of the day. The Cimarron was not going to recede before nightfall, and even if it did, Adelaide knew the meadow would be soft and treacherous for days after the water pulled back. There was no reasonable choice but to wait. Graham Brenner did not leave. This surprised Adelaide in a quiet, gradual way, because she had expected him to. He had done his good deed, delivered his warning, helped her carry her things, and that was a great deal more than most men in the territory would have done for a woman they did not know. She had expected him to tip his hat and ride off toward whatever the rest of his day had been, before he had been diverted into saving her homestead. Instead, he sat down in one of the 2 rough chairs by the fire, stretched his long legs out, and asked her if she had any coffee in among the things they had brought up. She had. She always brought coffee. They drank it in the small, fire-lit room while the sound of the river came up the ridge like a far-off conversation, and they talked. It began as the practical conversation of 2 people who had just been through something together and were still processing it. Graham told her about the rancher upstream, a man named Pete Ashford, who had ridden down to warn the settlement nearest to his claim, and sent his hired boy on to spread the word further south. Graham had been passing through the valley on his way back from Caldwell, where he had been settling a contract for the autumn cattle drive, and he had met Pete Ashford's boy on the road and understood immediately what needed to happen. "Did you warn the other claims?" Adelaide asked. She was sitting in the other chair, her hands wrapped around her tin coffee mug, watching him across the fire. "The Hensons, half a mile south of you, and the old German fellow Kruger on the west bank." The Hensons had already started moving. Kruger argued with me for 5 minutes before his wife overruled him and started throwing things out the door. Adelaide smiled at that. She knew Klaus Kruger. He was a stubborn, good-hearted man who had come to the territory from Bavaria 12 years ago and had the absolute conviction that sheer personal determination could defeat any obstacle, including acts of God. "And you came to my place last," she said. "You were the farthest south. I was going south to north originally, but Ashford's boy told me the flow was coming from the north, so I turned around." "Which means you came to me first," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I came to you first." There was something in the way he said it that was simple and unadorned, and Adelaide found she could not quite look away from him for a moment. And then she looked at the fire because she did not quite know what to do with whatever feeling was moving through her. She told him about the homestead then. She told him about arriving in the territory with Walter in 1879, about the claim, about the first winter, which had been brutal and nearly impossible, and which had taught her more about herself than the previous 24 years of her life combined. She was 26 now, and she did not feel young in the way that some women her age seemed to feel young. She felt the way a piece of wood felt after it had been seasoned properly, solid and reliable and occasionally lonely. She did not tell him the lonely part, but she told him about Walter briefly in the way she had learned to speak of him, which was direct and without excessive apology, the way you mention a geographical feature of the landscape you live in. "The river is there. Walter died. The winter is long." Graham listened without trying to fill every silence with reassurance, which was the thing most people did when the subject of a dead husband came up, and which Adelaide had always found exhausting. He just listened and nodded, and occasionally asked a question that showed he had been paying attention. He told her, in turn, about his own history with the territory. He had come up from Texas 8 years ago, working as a ranch hand on a drive through the nations, and finding himself, at the end of it, with enough money saved and enough of a sense of the land to stake a small cattle operation near the Kansas border. He had built it up slowly, methodically, adding a few head every year, learning the land and the weather patterns and the particular demands of ranching in the Oklahoma territory. He had a crew of 4 men, a small house that he had built himself, and a dog named Captain who he spoke of with the particular pride of a man who does not have children but has something that functions in a similar affectionate corner of the heart. "Do you have family nearby?" Adelaide asked. "My sister in Wichita," he said. "We write. She has 3 children and a husband who works the railroad. I see them when I can." He paused. "My parents are gone, my father when I was 17. My mother 2 years after that." "I am sorry," Adelaide said, and she meant it the way she meant it when she said it about something she actually understood. "You too," he said, nodding, and she understood that he meant her parents, not just Walter, because she had mentioned them earlier briefly, and he had been listening. The afternoon wore on. The fire was warm and the coffee was long gone, and they had eaten the bread Adelaide had wrapped up from the day before, the good loaf she had baked yesterday, not the dough that was even now presumably floating somewhere down the Cimarron. Adelaide fed Bess from the small store of feed she had thought to bring, and Graham went out and checked that the bundles and the trunk were properly secured under the eave against any wind. When he came back inside, he said, "The water looks like it has peaked. It is not rising as fast as it was. It will be 2 or 3 days before I can go back down," she said. "Probably." He stood in the doorway looking at her, and she looked back at him, and there was something unresolved in the air between them that was not the flood. "You have a long ride back to Caldwell," she said. "I am not in a hurry," he said. Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the spring evening was beginning to settle over the ridge, and the last of the light was coming in through the cabin's one small window in long, dusty bars of gold, and it caught in Graham Brenner's dark hair and in the gray-blue of his eyes, and Adelaide Hale, who had been alone for 2 years and who had told herself many times that she was fine with that she had made her peace with it, felt something shift inside her like a river changing course. "Then you are welcome to stay the night," she said. "It is a cold ride to make in the dark." "Thank you," he said, and he said it the same way she had said it to him that morning, completely and without embellishment, as though the word contained everything that needed to be said. The night was clear and cold, as spring nights in the territory often were after a rainstorm. They managed with the fire and the quilts from the trunk, Adelaide on the rope cot with 2 quilts piled over her, and Graham on the floor near the hearth with his saddle blanket and his duster, which he insisted was warm enough. She was not sure she believed him, but he seemed to sleep without much difficulty, or at least he was quiet, and eventually the crackling of the fire and the distant, diminishing murmur of the river settled around her like something familiar, and she slept too. She woke before he did, which was appropriate since she always woke before everyone and everything, and she lay in the gray pre-dawn dark of the cabin listening to his steady breathing and thinking, with a clarity that surprised her, that she could not remember the last time she had slept this well. She got up carefully and got the fire going again with the coals that were still alive beneath the ash, and she put water on to boil, and when Graham woke he found her sitting at the table with 2 cups ready, and a small pot of porridge that she had made from the oats she had thought to bring in the chaos of the previous morning because Adelaide Hale, even in an emergency, planned for breakfast. He sat up and looked at her and said, "You made breakfast." "I had oats," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite name, something between surprised and moved, and then he said, "I have not had anyone cook me breakfast in a very long time." "Nor I anyone to cook for," she said, and the honesty of it surprised her a little, and she looked at the fire. They ate together at the small table with the morning coming in through the window and Bess breathing peacefully outside and the chickens beginning to murmur in their corner, and Adelaide thought that she could not have predicted, 24 hours ago, that this morning would feel the way it did. After breakfast, Graham went out to check the level of the meadow below while Adelaide tended to Bess and sorted through the items they had brought up, taking a mental inventory of what had been saved and what inevitably had been left. The bread dough, 3 chairs. The curtains Walter had ordered from a catalog in Topeka, and which had arrived 6 months after he was dead, and which Adelaide had hung anyway because they were paid for, and because the cabin needed something. A small writing desk she had been meaning to move to a higher shelf for months and had not gotten around to. When Graham came back, his boots were muddy from the meadow, and his expression was measured in a way that told her the news was not catastrophic, but was not cheerful either. "You can see the cabin," he said. "The water reached your porch, maybe 4 or 5 inches inside from the look of the water line on the logs. The flood line is clear." Adelaide absorbed this. 4 or 5 inches of floodwater inside a cabin did significant damage. The floor would need to be scrubbed. Anything on low shelves would be ruined. The walls would take weeks to fully dry, and in that time the wood would warp and the plaster would crack and there would likely be mold to deal with. It was not a catastrophe in the absolute sense, but it was a great deal of work. "All right," she said. "The kitchen garden is gone," he said more gently. "I figured. I am sorry, Adelaide." It was the first time he had used her name, and it landed differently than she expected. Not improperly, nothing like that, but with a warmth that made her look at him. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me straight, and for yesterday." She paused. "And the name is not Miss or Ma'am, it is Adelaide. You have slept on my floor and eaten my porridge. We are past formality." The corner of his mouth pulled up in that almost smile again. "Graham," he said. "Graham," she repeated and nodded. He stayed 2 more days. This was perhaps not entirely what he had planned, but the circumstances argued for it convincingly. The meadow was still too wet on the 2nd day for safe travel, and there was genuine, practical work to be done in preparing for the return to the cabin. Graham split wood from a fallen tree near the ridge and stacked it under the eave against future need. He helped Adelaide sort through what had been brought up, and they talked while they worked, easily and at length, the way two people talk when they have already dispensed with the small and cautious version of conversation and moved into something more honest. She learned that he had almost left the territory twice. Once after a brutal winter in 1878, before he had fully established himself, when the cattle losses had been severe and the future of his operation had looked genuinely uncertain. And once 2 years later, when a woman in Caldwell, a widow named Martha Chen, had asked him to consider moving to Kansas City with her, where her family had a dry goods business. He had thought about it for several weeks and then quietly concluded that he was not a city man and that he was not, at that point, the right man for Martha Chen, whatever his feelings on the matter might have been. He said this without particular regret or defensiveness, just as a fact about himself, the way he might mention that he was not suited to working underground. Adelaide told him about the one other time she had almost left the territory herself, in the winter after Walter died, when his brother Daniel had written from Missouri offering her a place in his household, and the implicit understanding that she would become a kind of unpaid domestic helper to his family in exchange for the security of not being alone. She had thought about it for 2 days and then written back a polite and firm refusal and had never regretted it. She was not the kind of woman who could live that way, dependent and invisible in someone else's life. Whatever hardship her own claim brought, it was hers. Graham listened to this with an expression of quiet, steady respect that made Adelaide feel obscurely that she had been seen. On the morning of the 3rd day, the meadow was firm enough to walk, and Adelaide went down to assess the cabin. Graham went with her. He said, "You should not have to do that alone," and she found she did not argue. The flood line was just above her ankle on the outside wall, a dark, silty stain that the sun was already beginning to dry. Inside, the cabin smelled of river mud and damp wood, and everything below knee-height had been touched by the water. The floor was still slightly damp in places. The bottom shelf of the kitchen cupboard held a ruined quarter of cornmeal and 2 jars of preserves that had fortunately survived with their seals intact because they had been submerged, not exposed to air. The curtains from Topeka were ruined, the pale blue cotton stained brown and stiff with dried sediment, and Adelaide pulled them down without ceremony and folded them into the rag pile because there was no use in sentimentality about curtains. Graham began moving furniture while Adelaide started the work of scrubbing the floor. He did not ask her permission. He simply picked up the table and moved it to the yard to dry in the sun, and then came back for the chairs, and then began pulling the lower shelves out from the kitchen wall so they could dry properly. He worked the way she worked, thorough and efficient and without complaint. There was something deeply intimate about it, Adelaide realized, in a way she had not anticipated. Not intimate in any improper sense, but in the sense that letting someone see the inside of your home in its worst state, letting someone help you put it back together, was an act of genuine trust. You could not be proud or proper when you were scrubbing flood mud off your own floorboards with someone 2 feet away pulling apart your kitchen shelves. You were simply yourself in your difficulty, and either they were worthy of seeing that or they were not. Graham Brenner, she concluded, was worthy of it. By late afternoon the cabin was as clean as they could make it in a day, the floor scrubbed and drying, the furniture returned from the yard, the shelves back in place. The kitchen garden was a loss, but Adelaide already had a plan forming in her mind about replanting, about what there was still time to get into the ground this season if she started within the week. She was telling Graham about this while she made a simple supper of beans and salt pork from the stores they had brought back from the ridge, and he was sitting at the table, listening, and she noticed that he had been here for 3 days now, and the quality of his listening had not diminished. Most people, in her experience, stopped really listening after a while. They kept the shape of it, but the attention behind it drifted. Graham still had the same attentiveness he had arrived with, and it sat on her like warmth. "The beans will be ready in about 20 minutes," she said. "I should probably head out after supper," he said. "I have been gone 4 days from the ranch. My crew will manage, but there are things that need my attention." "Of course," Adelaide said, and she kept her voice entirely even. There was a pause. "I would like to come back," Graham said, "if you would not object to that." Adelaide set her wooden spoon down on the edge of the pot and looked at him. He was looking back at her with a directness that was entirely characteristic of him by now. No deflection, no performance, just the plain truth of what he was saying. "You live 2 days' ride from here," she said. "I know where I live," he said, and the near smile was there again. "That is a long way to come to see someone," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "So you would have to mean it," she said. "Adelaide." He said her name the way he had said it the first time, with that warmth in it. "I mean it." She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight of her cleaned and drying cabin, with the smell of beans and salt pork in the air and the sound of the Cimarron, much quieter now, and returned closer to its proper place, coming in through the window. She thought about 2 years of solitude. She thought about the morning this man had ridden into her yard at a full gallop to warn her that her life was about to be disrupted, and then had stayed to help her save it, and then had slept on her floor and eaten her porridge and listened to her talk about her kitchen garden with the same attention he brought to everything else. "All right," she said. "I would not object." His smile, when it came fully, was different from the near smile. It changed his whole face, made it younger and lighter and very real, and Adelaide turned back to her beans because she was not entirely sure what to do with the feeling that smile put in her chest. He left after supper. He saddled the dark horse whose name she had learned was Ranger, a name she found perfectly appropriate, and he tied on the few things he had brought, which were minimal. He shook her hand at first, which was the correct and proper thing to do, and then he seemed to think about it and instead just looked at her for a moment in the way he had, that blue-gray steadiness, and said, "Take care of yourself, Adelaide Hale." "I always do," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I will come back in 3 weeks." 3 weeks, she said, as though filing it somewhere useful. He rode south, and Adelaide stood on her porch and watched the darkness swallow him up, and then she went inside and sat down at her table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed. The cabin was quiet around her in a way that was different from the quiet it had been before he arrived. It was not the empty kind. It was the kind that held a shape, the shape of something that was not yet here but was coming. She was up the next morning at her usual hour, and she began re-establishing the rhythm of her life with practical purpose. She swept the cabin again. She tended to Bess and the chickens. She made a list of what needed to be replanted in the kitchen garden, and figured out the timeline with the care of a woman who understood exactly what each vegetable required and what the remaining growing season would allow. She wrote to the general store in the nearest town, Guthrie, to ask about the availability of seeds and a few supplies she would need for the repair work. And she wrote, without quite letting herself think too hard about the fact that she was doing it, a short letter to Graham Brenner at the ranch near Caldwell, telling him that the cabin was drying out properly and that she had identified which of the floor planks would need replacing, and that she hoped Ranger and Captain were both well. She was not sure if that letter was appropriate. She sent it anyway, because Adelaide Hale had decided, at some point in the past few days, that she was done waiting on appropriateness when she could simply be honest. His reply came in 12 days, which was faster than she had expected given the distance and the unreliable nature of territorial mail service. He had excellent handwriting, she noted, careful and even, the writing of a man who took the act seriously. He told her about the ranch and about Captain who had, in his absence, gotten into a violent disagreement with a porcupine and come out significantly the worse for it. He told her that the spring drive was being organized for mid-May and that his crew was in good shape. He told her that the floor planks she mentioned would likely need to be cut from green wood and allowed to dry in place, which was not ideal, but was the practical solution in the territory where seasoned lumber was expensive and scarce. And at the end, in a hand that she thought was perhaps slightly less careful than the rest of the letter, as though he had written it quickly and then not gone back to correct it, he said that he thought about the 3 days on the ridge and at the cabin more often than was probably reasonable for a man who had a ranch to run, and that 3 weeks felt like a long time. Adelaide read that last part twice. Then she folded the letter and put it in the box under her bed with the other things she could not replace, and she went back to work. He came back in 22 days. She was not counting, but she noticed. He was a day early. He arrived in the late morning this time, at an ordinary pace, not urgency but not caution either, just the direct and purposeful way he seemed to do most things. He had the lumber she needed in a roll of oilskin across the back of his saddle, 3 good planks of pine that he had gotten somewhere in Guthrie on his way through, and when she said that she had not asked him to bring lumber, he said, "You mentioned it in your letter. You said you needed planks." "I was making conversation about my floor," she said. "I know," he said. "I brought you planks anyway." She looked at him standing in her yard with the lumber and ranger and the May morning around him, and she felt something she had not felt in 2 years, something she had almost forgotten was possible in the daily business of surviving alone on the Oklahoma frontier, something that was warm and slightly terrifying and entirely unwelcome to argue with. She said, "Do you want coffee?" "Very much," he said. He stayed 4 days this time, because there was legitimate work to be done, and she genuinely needed a second pair of hands to do it properly. He replaced the damaged floor planks with the focused competence she was coming to recognize as simply how he approached any task, and she handed him tools and held boards in place, and they worked in the kind of close proximity that required coordination and trust in equal measure. In the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the Cimarron, which was running at its proper level now, clear and quiet in the evening light, as though it had never behaved any differently. "It is a beautiful piece of land," Graham said, looking out across the meadow. "It is," she agreed, "even after everything." "Especially after everything," he said, and she thought he might have meant more than the land. She asked him on the 3rd evening something she had been thinking about but had not quite asked. "When you came that morning," she said, "to warn me, you came to my claim first, you said, because I was farthest south and you had turned around, but you also spent more time here than anywhere else. You spent 3 days. He was quiet for a moment. The river moved below them, catching the last of the light. "The Hensons were already moving," he said. "Kruger had his wife to argue with and then eventually to help him. And you were alone." He paused. "I did not want to leave someone alone in that." "You could have left once I was to the ridge," she said, not accusingly, just honestly. "I could have," he agreed, "but you did not." "No," he looked at her. "I did not want to." Adelaide held his gaze for a moment, feeling the weight of the evening and the river sound and the entirely uncomplicated truth of what was happening between them. "I am glad," she said. "So am I," he said. "More than I expected to be, if I am being honest. I came out here thinking I was doing what any decent person would do, and then I found myself having breakfast with you and I thought, this is something else entirely." "Something else," she repeated softly. "Something I have not had before," he said. "And I am 30 years old and I have not had it before, so when I say that, I want you to understand that I mean it with some seriousness." Adelaide Hale sat in the last of the evening light and thought about the fact that she was 26 and had been married and widowed, and had spent 2 years building a life from the ground up with her own 2 hands, and that she had convinced herself she was complete, that she did not require anything more than what she had made. And she thought about the fact that sitting here on this porch with Graham Brenner felt like being given something she had not known she was missing. The way you do not know a room is dark until someone brings a lamp into it. "I believe you," she said, and then more quietly, "I think it is the same for me." He reached over very carefully, as though he was aware of the weight of it, and covered her hand where it rested on the porch rail. His hand was warm and rough with calluses and absolutely steady, and Adelaide turned her hand over so their palms met, and they sat like that while the last light went out of the sky and the stars came out over the Oklahoma territory in a great, blazing, indifferent crowd, and the Cimarron moved on below them, minding its own business at last. He came back 6 weeks after that, and 6 weeks after that. Each visit longer, each conversation deeper, each silence more comfortable than the last. He brought her things sometimes, not extravagant things, nothing showy, but things that were useful and that showed he had been paying attention. A good quality jar of cinnamon from the general store in Guthrie, because she had mentioned once that her supply was running low, and cinnamon was one of the small pleasures she allowed herself in the morning. A book of natural history that had arrived at the Caldwell post office, addressed to someone who had apparently moved on without claiming it, and which Graham had acquired from the postmaster for 50 cents because Adelaide had mentioned she liked to read and owned only 3 books. She gave him things too. The bread she made always when he came, because she liked feeding people, and because Graham ate it with a genuine appreciation that was deeply gratifying. A pair of gloves she had mended for him using her best stitching, because his own were worn through in the palms. And once, at the end of a visit in the hot, heavy August, when he was saddling Ranger and preparing to leave, and she was standing in the yard with the sun on her back, and the knowledge that she would not see him for 6 weeks pressing on her like something physical, she put her hand on his arm, and when he turned she reached up and kissed him. It was not a long kiss, or a reckless one. It was deliberate and clear and entirely intentional, which was appropriate, because Adelaide Hale did not do things accidentally. She kissed him the way she said everything, directly and without apology, and when she pulled back he stood very still for a moment with his hand resting on Ranger's saddle, and an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, something open and almost undone. "Adelaide," he said. "I know," she said. "I know, but 6 weeks is a long time and I did not want you to leave without having done that." He looked at her for a long moment in the August heat. Then he stepped toward her and kissed her back properly, with both hands holding her face and all the directness and steadiness that was the essential nature of him, and it was nothing like the careful, almost apologetic kiss she had initiated and everything like the man she had come to know over the course of this extraordinary summer. When they stepped apart, they were both breathing differently. "I have been wanting to do that," he said, "since the morning I rode into your yard and you asked me who I was before you would take my word for anything." "You should have done it sooner," she said. "You should have," he said. "I just did," she pointed out. "You did," he said and laughed, a real laugh, warm and surprised, and Adelaide had never in her life been so pleased with herself. He did not leave that afternoon. He did not leave for another 3 days, and on the morning of the 4th day, sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee and the morning light coming in through the new cotton curtains she had gotten from a woman in Guthrie, which were white with small red flowers, and which were nothing like the Topeka curtains but which she liked better, he said, "Adelaide, I want to say something." "All right," she said. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment and she realized with a small internal start that he was nervous. Graham Brenner, who faced down floods and stubborn cattle, and whatever other difficulties his life presented with a calm, unflappable practicality, was nervous at her kitchen table. "I have spent the better part of the last 4 months riding back and forth across this territory," he said, "and I want you to understand that I do not regret a single mile of it, because every time I came back here was worth it. But I also want you to understand that I am done with the leaving part." He looked up at her. "I think I am in love with you, Adelaide. I know it is fast. I know you have a life here that you built yourself and that you are proud of, and you should be proud of it. I'm not asking you to give any of it up, but I would like very much to stop leaving." Adelaide sat with this for a moment. Outside, a meadowlark was singing in the cottonwoods, the way they did in the mornings, and Bess was moving in her small pasture, and the Cimarron was running clean and quiet in the distance. "I think I am in love with you too," she said. I have been fairly certain of it for at least 2 months, but I did not want to be hasty." He looked at her with those gray-blue eyes, and the warmth in them was something she wanted to look at every morning for a very long time. "What does that mean, then?" he said carefully. "For what comes next?" "It means," Adelaide said, "that I think you should ask me to marry you, Graham. And before you say anything, I want you to know that I am not a woman who does anything the easy or expected way, and I have a claim I intend to keep, and a cow I am very attached to, and firm opinions about the kitchen garden. If those are things you can manage, then ask me." The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "Adelaide Hale," he said, "will you marry me? And for the record, I can manage all of that and more, and I find your opinions about the kitchen garden to be among your most admirable qualities." "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." The wedding was in October, which was not the traditional June wedding, but was the right time for a woman with a kitchen garden and a cattle ranch between them to get such things managed. They married in the small Methodist church in Guthrie, with the territory spread out golden and dry around it under an impossibly blue autumn sky. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Thomas Ellery, who was a practical and kind man who had performed a great many territorial weddings, and understood that the people before him had usually already survived a considerable amount before arriving at his pulpit. Graham's sister, Margaret, came from Wichita with her husband and their 3 children, and she was a compact, bright-eyed woman who had her brother's directness and also his capacity for warmth, and she embraced Adelaide with an immediate, uncomplicated affection that Adelaide found completely disarming and deeply welcome. "He wrote me about the flood," Margaret told Adelaide, pulling back from the embrace and looking at her with frank appraisal. "He wrote me about riding from claim to claim with the warning, and then about your cabin and the ridge and how you made porridge, and asked his credentials. I thought, that is the woman for my brother, no question. He told you about the porridge?" Adelaide said. "He told me about the porridge very specifically," Margaret said. "He said it was the best breakfast he had in years. I think what he meant was that it was you, but Graham expresses himself through practical details." "I have noticed that about him," Adelaide said. "It is an excellent quality," Margaret said firmly, "once you know what to look for." The reception was a simple supper in the church hall, with good roast beef and cornbread, and 3 kinds of pie, because Adelaide had baked the pies herself and she believed firmly in variety. The crew from Graham's ranch attended, 4 men who were plainly fond of their employer and looked at Adelaide with a welcoming, slightly shy regard that told her they had been hoping something like this would happen. Klaus Kruger came from across the river, his wife Hilda on his arm, and Kruger shook Graham's hand with great solemnity and told him he was a man of good sense and good character, and that the flood had done at least one good thing, which was to bring these 2 people together. And even if the river took his good fence posts, it had also delivered something worthwhile. The Hensons came too, a warm couple who had lived beside Adelaide's claim for 3 years and who had always been good neighbors, and their eldest daughter Mary, who was 12, and had decided that Adelaide's wedding was the most romantic thing she had ever seen, which Adelaide found both endearing and somewhat overstated, given that it was a fairly practical occasion overall. Adelaide and Graham went back to the homestead that night rather than leaving on any kind of journey, because there was no practical time for journeying with a cattle operation and a homestead both to be managed, and neither of them particularly wanted to be anywhere else. The cabin felt different with the 2 of them in it together, in the permanent, decided way, not like a visit but like a life. Graham's few personal belongings were here now, the things he had brought over the past 2 weeks as they had organized the combining of their lives, and they sat among Adelaide's things without discord, the way 2 pieces of furniture from different origins can sometimes be placed together in a room and simply fit. He had arranged for his foreman, a capable man named Sam Hartley, to take primary responsibility for the ranch near Caldwell, with the understanding that Graham would be there several days a month for the larger decisions and the seasonal work. This was not a perfect arrangement, but it was a workable one, and Graham and Adelaide had sat together and worked it out the way they did everything, directly and practically, and with equal say on both sides. Adelaide was not going to leave her homestead, and Graham was not willing to leave her, and so the solution was to make the distance work until they could think of something better. The something better presented itself in the spring of 1883, when the rancher on the south side of the river valley, an aging man named Herbert Castle, decided he had had enough of the territory and was going to his daughter's home in St. Louis. He offered Graham first right on the purchase of his claim, which was a good piece of land that included a larger house than either Graham's ranch house or Adelaide's cabin, and which sat on the high ground above the Cimarron flood plain on the west side of the valley, close enough to Adelaide's claim to manage both, but high enough that no spring flood was going to touch it. They talked about it for 2 evenings, sitting at Adelaide's kitchen table with the oil lamp between them and a pencil and a piece of paper where they had worked out numbers and possibilities in both their handwriting. It was, Adelaide thought, a very satisfying document, the two of them making a decision together on a piece of paper, with the evening quiet around them and the lamp warm and the territory outside the window doing whatever it pleased. They bought the Castle place. Graham's ranch near Caldwell was sold to Sam Hartley, who had always wanted to own his own operation and who had the character and the competence to make it work. The remaining crew from the old ranch came south with them to the valley, 3 of the 4 men, because the work needed them, and because they had decided Adelaide and Graham were people worth following. The move to the Castle house happened in early May of 1883, on a day of enormous golden light and brisk wind that sent the cottonwood seeds spinning across the meadow like slow, lazy snow. Adelaide supervised the moving of her things with characteristic thoroughness, and Graham organized the ranch equipment and the cattle with characteristic efficiency, and by the end of the day they were standing on the porch of the Castle house, which sat high and dry on its ridge with a wide view of the valley and the river below, and the cabin they had cleaned and repaired and loved was still there, visible from the porch, and Adelaide decided immediately that she was going to use it as a workroom. For the mending and the sewing she took in, and for the days when she needed space to think. "You are going to keep the cabin," Graham said. "Of course I am going to keep the cabin," she said. "That cabin is where we met." He looked at her with the particular expression he had, the one that had become familiar to her and that she valued above almost anything else, that warm, steady blue-gray regard. "I rode into your yard," he said. "I would not exactly say we met at the cabin." "You came inside the cabin," she said. "You moved the trunk, you ate my bread." "Fair enough," he said. "We met at the cabin." She laughed and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood on the porch of their new house in the May light and looked out at their valley, the Cimarron running peaceful and silver in the distance, the meadow green and full and forgiving of everything that had happened to it, the way good land always is. Adelaide was expecting their first child by that November, which she had figured out in September, and had told Graham on a Friday evening while he was mending a piece of harness at the kitchen table, the same direct, unadorned delivery she used for everything important in her life. She watched his hands go still on the harness, and then he looked up at her, and she had never quite seen that expression on his face before. It was entirely new, stripped of everything except pure, genuine feeling. He came around the table and held her carefully, the way you hold something you are afraid of damaging, and she said, "Graham, I'm not fragile." "I know you are not," he said into her hair. "You are the least fragile person I have ever encountered. I just want to hold you for a moment." So she let him. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a hard one, as most territory winters were, but they had enough wood and enough provisions, and they had each other, which Adelaide had always known was a considerable advantage, and was now absolutely confirmed. Graham was present in the way he was present for everything, attentive and steady, doing the extra work that the pregnancy made difficult for Adelaide without making her feel diminished or managed. He did not tell her what she could and could not do. He simply appeared alongside her when things were heavy and made himself useful, which was exactly what she needed. Their son was born in March of 1884, on a cold, clear night when the stars over the territory were so bright they seemed like something invented. He was a healthy, loud, large-brained boy with Graham's gray-blue eyes and Adelaide's stubborn set to the jaw, and they named him Walter Joseph Brenner. The Walter was for Adelaide's late husband, which Graham had offered without any difficulty or awkwardness because he was the kind of man who understood that honoring the past did not diminish the present, and the Joseph was for Graham's father. Walter Joseph Brenner was, from his first weeks of life, an opinionated and energetic child who made his presence known loudly and without apology, and who was passed back and forth between his parents in the night, with a kind of easy, tired, cooperative grace that Adelaide would remember years later as one of the most intimate things they had ever shared. There was something about the middle of the night, with a small, loud person between you demanding attention, that stripped away everything that was not absolutely essential and left only the core of what you were to each other. Margaret came from Wichita in April and stayed for 3 weeks and was wonderful with the baby and with Adelaide and with Graham, whom she teased mercilessly about his expression of besotted amazement every time he looked at his son. "You look like you have never seen a baby before," Margaret told him. "I have never seen my baby before," Graham said simply, and that was all there was to say about it. The homestead thrived through the years that followed. Adelaide kept her kitchen garden on the ridge now, safe above any flood line, and it was more expansive and productive than the original one had ever been, laid out in neat rows on the south-facing slope with the careful system she had developed over years of trial and adjustment. She kept Bess until the old cow died in the autumn of 1885, quietly and without fuss, in the way good animals sometimes go, and Adelaide sat with her for an hour before calling Graham, which he understood completely. The ranch grew. They added cattle in good years and held steady in lean ones, making decisions together with the same pencil and paper method they had started with, both voices equal, both sets of knowledge valued. Graham's understanding of cattle and range and weather was deep and practical. Adelaide's understanding of the economics of a homestead, of preservation and provision and the long-term management of limited resources, was equally deep, and together they made a considerably better operation than either would have managed alone. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara Margaret Brenner, the Margaret for Graham's sister who was delighted and possibly somewhat smug about it, arrived in the summer of 1886. Clara was quieter than her brother from the beginning, a watchful, quick-minded child who learned to sit up and look at things very seriously before she had any business doing so, and who grew into the kind of small person who asked the question that nobody had thought to ask and waited patiently for the answer. Walter Joseph, by this time a solid, fierce, adventurous 2-year-old, received his sister with the cautious interest of someone inspecting a new piece of equipment whose function was not entirely clear, and then gradually, over the course of several weeks, became her devoted protector, a role he took extremely seriously and maintained without any prompting for the rest of his childhood. The valley continued to change around them, as the territory was changing. More settlers came in the years following the land runs, the great rush of April 1889 that brought thousands of people flooding into the Oklahoma Territory in a single day, staking claims on land that had been promised and repromised and promised again, and which the original inhabitants, the tribes of the nations who had been relocated here from the east in the previous generation, watched with the grief and fury that Adelaide, who had listened to some of what was said about it in the towns, found deeply troubling. The injustice of it sat on her, the repeated breaking of promises, the reduction of land that had been guaranteed, the way the needs and rights of one group were simply subordinated to the convenience of another, and she said so when it came up, which was more often than some of her neighbors appreciated. Graham agreed with her. He had seen, in his years working cattle drives through the nations, the consequences of what had been done to the people who had lived in this land before any of them arrived, and he had no comfortable story to tell himself about it. They were settlers, and they benefited from the settlement, and that fact did not disappear because they were decent in their personal dealings. It was a thing they talked about honestly, without resolution, because there was no easy resolution to be had, and Adelaide thought that at least they were not pretending. The springs continued to come, and with them the Cimarron's recurring announcements of its own authority. The river flooded in the spring of 1885 and again in the spring of 1888, but the new house on the ridge never came close to the water, and Adelaide stood on the porch during both events and watched the river make its argument for its own territory and felt, each time, a strange and complicated gratitude for the first flood, the one that had brought Graham riding across her meadow in the gray morning with urgency in his voice and something in his eyes that she had known, even then, without knowing she knew it, was not going to be ordinary. She told him this one evening in the spring of 1888, standing on the porch and watching the Cimarron spread itself across the low meadow in its familiar annual reclamation. Walter was 5 and Clara was nearly 2, and they were inside with Margaret's eldest daughter, who had come to stay for the season and who was patient and capable with children. "Do you ever think about the morning you rode in?" she said. "Every time the river rises," he said. "And," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. The evening was warm, the kind of Oklahoma spring evening that felt like a gift after the long winter, and the air smelled of wet earth and new grass and the faint mineral bite of the river. "I think about how close I came to not turning around," he said. "I almost kept going south. I thought, I have already warned the claims I have passed, maybe it is enough. And then I thought of the ones I had not warned and I turned around." "You did not know about me specifically," she said. "You did not know I was alone." "No," he said. "I did not know anything except that there were people who needed the warning. You could have been anyone. But you were you," he said, "and that was—" He paused, not because he lacked the words but because he was choosing carefully, the way he always did when something mattered. "That was the best thing that ever happened to me, without exception." Adelaide looked at the river for a moment, at the brown water spreading peacefully across the meadow in the evening light, reclaiming its old ground the way it always did, patient and inevitable. "You carried my grandmother's dishes up to the ridge," she said. "In the trunk. You just picked it up without being asked." "You told me to carry the trunk," he said, slightly amused. "You knew what was in it before I told you," she said. "And you carried it as though the things inside were worth something. Most men would have just heaved it over a shoulder and been done with it." He looked at her with the expression she had never tired of seeing in all the years of their marriage, that warm, steady, entirely serious attention. "Everything you have is worth something," he said. "Everything you chose to save is worth something. I was not going to be careless with it." Adelaide looked at her husband in the spring evening and felt the fullness of the life they had made together press against the inside of her chest in a way that was almost too large to hold. She reached over and took his hand, the warm and calloused hand that she knew completely, and he held hers in the sure, undemonstrative way that was entirely him, not holding on for show but holding on because he meant it. "Come inside," she said. "Supper is ready and Walter is going to wake up Clara if we leave them much longer." "In a minute," he said, and did not move. She stayed too. They stood on the porch in the last of the light with the river doing what rivers do, and the sky going gold, and then rose and then a deep, clear blue above the cottonwoods. And the chickens, which were a new generation of chickens now, but occupied the same sturdy wire coop, settling in for the night with their reliable, indignant commentary on the evening. And the lamp going on in the kitchen behind them, where their children were being managed with reasonable success by a capable young woman who was being paid fair wages for the work, because Adelaide had opinions about that too. She thought about all of it: the morning with the flood water coming, the bread dough left on the counter, the trunk carried up the ridge, the fire in the trapper's cabin, the coffee and the porridge, and the conversation that had not once stopped feeling like something she wanted more of. She thought about the letter she had written without quite admitting to herself what she was doing, and the letter that had come back, and the visits, and the kiss in the August heat, and the October wedding in Guthrie with the meadowlark yellow light on the stone church. She thought about Walter Joseph with his gray-blue eyes and Clara with her serious, watching face, and the kitchen garden on the south slope, and the cabin below the ridge that still stood, still sound, still hers, where she went on afternoons when she needed the specific, particular quiet of a room that had held the beginning of everything. A life. An actual, full, good life. The river had tried to take it. Instead, it had delivered Graham Brenner to her porch on a gray April morning in 1882, and Adelaide thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the Cimarron could flood every spring from now until the end of time, and she would not begrudge it a single acre of meadow. They went inside for supper. Walter Joseph had in fact woken Clara, who was presently sitting on the kitchen floor with an expression of imperial displeasure that Clara brought to all inconveniences. Graham picked her up and she grabbed his shirt in her small fists and grumbled, and he carried her to the table and sat down with her in his lap, and Walter climbed into his own chair and looked at the bread Adelaide was bringing from the counter with an attention that was purely his father's, focused and appreciative and entirely without pretense. They said grace, which they did in the straightforward, grateful manner of people who knew precisely what they had to be grateful for, and did not require much elaboration. They ate supper, and Walter told an elaborate and largely fictional story about something that had happened in the yard that afternoon involving Captain's son, a young dog named Sergeant who had inherited his father's regrettable tendency toward porcupines. They listened and laughed, and Adelaide refilled coffee cups, and Clara fell asleep against Graham's chest with her fist still holding his shirt, and the lamp burned warm and steady in the kitchen of the house on the ridge above the Cimarron, and outside the territory went about its enormous, indifferent, beautiful business in the spring night. In the years that followed, the valley changed and so did the territory, but the Brenner homestead remained, expanding gradually in the way of things that are well tended, adding a second barn, a proper chicken coop that was the envy of their neighbors, and a second vegetable garden on the north slope that Adelaide developed into a serious enterprise, supplying 3 families in addition to their own household. Graham added a good herd of horses to the cattle operation, a decision he had been working toward for several years, and which Adelaide supported entirely, having learned enough about the horse trade to understand that it was the coming business in the territory as the automobile age began making its distant, rumored presence felt in the cities, because people who could not afford automobiles, which was most people in the territory for a considerable time yet, still needed horses, and people who could afford automobiles still needed working horses for the land. Walter Joseph grew into a boy of considerable determination and physical capability, who spent every available hour learning the ranch from his father, with the same serious, intent focus that Clara brought to her reading. He could work cattle by the time he was 9 in a way that earned the respect of the hired men, not because he was pushed to it, but because he found it genuinely engaging, the puzzle of managing animals, the reading of weather and land, the particular satisfaction of a thing done right. He had Adelaide's stubbornness and Graham's patience, which was a formidable combination. Clara, by the time she was 7, had read every book in the house and had started on the books of their neighbors, who lent them willingly because Clara returned them promptly and with thoughtful commentary. She also had, to everyone's mild astonishment, a gift for mathematics that expressed itself in the most practical possible way. She simply saw the numbers in any situation and understood their relationships with an ease that her parents recognized as something to be cultivated rather than managed. Adelaide, who had always balanced her own household accounts with the careful methodicalness of someone who could not afford an error, began including Clara in the process by the time the girl was 8, and found that, within a season, Clara had moved from learning to quietly improving, suggesting a better system for tracking the egg sales that Adelaide adopted without embarrassment. Graham watched this with a pride so deep it was almost speechless, which was consistent with how he felt about most things he truly cared about. Margaret visited every year or two, and her children grew up alongside Walter and Clara in the loose, occasional, warm way of cousins who do not see each other constantly, but have the right foundation for friendship. And these visits were among the reliably best days of the year, full of noise and outdoor adventures and long evening conversations on the porch, while the children ran themselves to useful exhaustion in the yard. In the summer of 1891, Adelaide's kitchen garden was large enough and productive enough that she hired help for the heavy work, a young woman from the settlement 3 miles south named Rosa Fuentes, whose family had been in the territory longer than most of the Anglo settlers and who was, Adelaide quickly discovered, both extremely capable and entirely uninterested in being treated as anything other than an equal partner in the work. This suited Adelaide perfectly, and the two women established a working relationship that was also, over time, a genuine friendship, talking across the bean rows about their opinions on the territory and on people, and on the particular difficulties of managing livestock in dry summers, with a frankness and mutual respect that Adelaide valued as much as anything in her life. The turn of the 1890s brought challenges, as the territory navigated its path toward statehood, and the politics and injustices of land allocation continued to have consequences for everyone who lived there. The Brenner homestead was not untouched by the economic pressures of the decade. The drought of 1893 was particularly hard, and there was a winter that year when the accounts were close enough to difficult that Adelaide and Graham spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table going over them with all their combined attention, finding the places to reduce and the places that could not be reduced without endangering the enterprise altogether, and making the decisions together with the steady, unsentimental practicality that had always characterized the way they faced hard things. They came through it. They always came through it. On a September evening in 1894, 12 years after the flood that had brought Graham to Adelaide's door, they sat on the porch of the house on the ridge as they had sat on every warm enough evening that they could manage for 12 years, and the valley below them was golden in the autumn light, the Cimarron running low and calm in its late-season way, the cottonwoods just beginning to turn, and Adelaide thought about the morning she had been elbow-deep in bread dough and heard the hoofbeats. She thought about the urgency of it, the way he had ridden into her yard with the warning, and she had stood on her porch with flour on her hands and asked him who he was before she would move. She thought about the trunk and the grandmother's dishes and the climb up the ridge with the chickens complaining and Bess being led by a man she had known for perhaps 30 minutes. She thought about the fire in the old trapper's cabin and the coffee and the porridge and the way he had listened. She thought about the word stayed and all that it contained. He had come to warn her, and he had stayed. He had stayed through the night in the cabin, and through the 3 days of drying out, and through the visits that became permanent, and through the wedding and the children and the drought and the good years and the hard ones. And he was here now, beside her on the porch in the September light, with Walter inside probably already asleep after a day that would have felled a smaller person, and Clara at the table with her books as always, and Sargent, who was elderly now but still present, lying at the bottom of the porch steps in the last of the warmth. Graham reached over without looking at her and found her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair and held it. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "The flood," she said. He said. "Do you remember," she said, "that I left bread dough on the counter? You mention it with some regularity," he said, very dry. "It bothers me still," she said, "all that work." "Adelaide," he said, and she could hear the laughter he was not quite releasing. "I know," she said, "I know." She looked at the river, at the valley, at the light on the cottonwoods. It was worth it. Every part of it was worth it, even the bread dough. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, a gesture so familiar and so entirely his that it settled through her like warmth, settling through a room when the fire is right. "Yes," he said, "all of it." They sat in the September quiet while the stars began to appear above the Oklahoma territory, one by one and then all at once, the way the stars always did out here, enormous and indifferent and magnificent, the same stars that had been here before any of them arrived and would be here after, over the land that asked everything of the people who chose it and gave back everything it had in return. Below them, the Cimarron moved through the valley in its patient, silver way, keeping its own counsel, making its own decisions about where to go and when to spread and when to pull back and rest. Adelaide had made her peace with the river long ago. It had taken from her and given to her in equal measure, and she could not in good conscience hold a grudge against anything that had a part in bringing Graham Brenner to her door on a gray April morning 12 years past. The lamp went on in the kitchen where Clara was reading. Sargent sighed and shifted at the bottom of the steps. The cottonwoods along the river moved in the evening wind with their dry, papery sound, and Adelaide Hale Brenner, who had been alone and then had not been, who had built one life from the ground up, and then built another alongside someone who understood the value of the foundation she had already made, held her husband's hand in the last of the September light and felt, with the specific and unargued certainty of a woman who knew the difference between surviving and living, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Everything they had was here on this high ground above the Cimarron, everything that mattered, everything worth carrying. And he had helped her carry it, all of it, every piece, from the day he first came riding across that flooded meadow with a warning and a willingness to stay, and had never once put it down.